Hey folks, well it's Wednesday again, time for a Bible study. Tonight I'm going to tell you a story about a guy named Joe. Usually on Sundays we've been going through the New Testament and talking about the life of Jesus. But it's good to jump back into the Old Testament every once in a while and hear about the things that happened that led up to Jesus coming. Now we all know that Abraham was father of the Jews, and being Jesus was a Jew, he's the father of us Christians too, or forefather anyway. Well, Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob, who was renamed Israel, who had a son named Joseph. In Genesis 37 we read that Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about him. So he was kind of a tattletale, he was telling his dad on his brothers. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made him a richly ornamented robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field." That's where you round up the grain out of the field and bundle it up and stack up different piles so that you could, pick them up and move them on to the storehouse. And so says we were building up sheaves of grain out in the field. Then suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brother, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived in Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him." I guess the cistern was like a hole in the ground out in the desert. Maybe somebody dug it for a well or something, I don't know. But anyway, they decide they're going to throw him down in the hole and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, that's his older brother, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. I guess he planned, you just throw him in the hole and leave him in there, and then when the rest of them left, Reuben, I guess, was going to pull him out and take him home. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is a brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Down here on the bottom of the page it says that was about 8 ounces of silver. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes, went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." You know, it was just full of blood. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. His heart was broke. He thought his boy was dead. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now picture this. Here this shepherd boy from, little town out in the boonies gets sold to a bunch of merchants. You know, they probably put chains on him and they're dragging him to Egypt behind a bunch of camels. And when he got to Egypt, you know, at that time Egypt was like, it would be like a hillbilly going to New York City, you know. You know, he was walking past the Sphinx and the pyramids and, you know, it was like a whole different world from what he was used to. When they got him there, they sold him to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now the Pharaoh, you know, that was like the king of Egypt. And if this guy is the, you know, captain of the guard of the Pharaoh, he's pretty high up on the food chain too. So Joseph, he was in a whole different world. You know, he was probably seeing stuff that he had never even imagined. In Genesis 39, we pick it up. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's official, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, you know, like, okay, he's a slave, you know, he's in the house of this big shot, but evidently everything he was told to do, he done it well. And this guy thought, wow, the Lord is with this kid. You know, he's a good slave. You know, he's talented. He's, you know, really special. Everything he did prospered. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, and Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. So, like, he was, you know, the top slave. He was his master's attendant. You know, that's like his own personal butler or whatever. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a little while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Now imagine this. Here this shepherd boy is hauled off to Egypt, put in chains, made a slave, and he's put in charge of his master's house and everything he owns, and now his master's wife is trying to seduce him. Now I don't know how long this was after, they took him there, but it said that, it started off, he was 17 years old, so it could have been a few months, might have been a couple of years, but he was still a young guy. And, the way I understand it back then, the rich guys and the kings and the officials and all, they pretty much had their choice of the prettiest women. So this gal, she was probably pretty hot. And Joseph, he was a good-looking young guy, and, she offered him some loving. But he turned her down. Now, he's a slave, and back then, at that time, male slaves were made eunuchs. Their masters didn't want them, messing with their women, so they would basically castrate them, make them eunuchs where they didn't have to worry about it. Well, they hadn't got around to castrating him yet, but he probably knew they were planning on doing it. But still, even though that may have been the only time in his life he would ever have sex with a woman, he turned it down. Says, but he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. Because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Like after a while, he just stayed away from her. And one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. And she caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Now she was lying. You know, she was mad because he turned her down. She probably wasn't used to that. Her pride was hurt. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. He believed her. He was mad. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to doing anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. The Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's official, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to him, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "And this is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing in a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. And then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. And then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings." Pharaoh was once angry with his servant, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. The Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, In my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek. And they grazed among the reeds, and after them came up 7 other cows, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. And I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing in a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason for the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms. It is the matter that has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. In other words, God gave you the same dream in 2 different forms, but it's the same dream. Like he repeated himself just to make sure you get it. So he's really, really going to do it. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store it up, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked him, "Can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God?" And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. When Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt," Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Wow. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the countries that came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. Now, if you remember, we started off, Joseph, he was just a shepherd boy in the land of Canaan with a dream that his brothers and his mother and father would all bow down to him one day. Well, here we are, 13 years later. Like, he was 17 when he was sold into slavery, and 30 when he became second in command. Well, no, he was probably older than that, because they had all the years of plenty and then the years of famine. So, yeah, it was 7 years of famine. So, figure 13 and 14, that would be 27 years. So here we are 27 years later, and sure enough, his brothers and his mother and father are bowing down to him. Because they're starving to death and they need food. And he's the one they gotta come and see and get it. But, you know, the Bible says all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So, there's the proof right there. Like Joseph, he went through some hard times, but it all worked out good for him. Every step of the way, God was with him. You know, even when he got sold into slavery, every thing he touched prospered. You know, and even when Potiphar's wife accused him of making a pass at her and he got thrown into prison, like, he probably didn't realize it then, but looking back on it, I bet he was probably glad that happened. Because if that hadn't have happened, he would have ended up becoming a eunuch, and he wouldn't have them 2 sons or his wife. You know, and if he hadn't been in prison, he would never been able to interpret the dreams of them other 2 guys that were in there, that one of them ended up a couple of years later telling the Pharaoh about him. And when the Pharaoh was having some bad dreams, he would have never ended up meeting the Pharaoh and interpreting his dream and becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt. So God had his hand on Joseph every step of the way, because Joseph loved God. That's the reason he turned that woman down. And God had a purpose for him. And because of Joseph, a whole lot of people didn't starve to death. I done a little double checking, and it turns out that his mother had died, but his father and his brothers ended up bowing down to him. But if she hadn't have died, she would have been right there with them all, bowing down too. So his dream did come true. You know, I'm learning as I go, folks. There's a whole lot of stuff to keep track of in here, and I'm trying hard as I can to get it right. So bear with me. And I'll catch you later.